Good evening. I'm Steve Cohen, a professor at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs and Vice Dean of Columbia's School of Professional Studies. Welcome to the second event in our Ideas Exchange series this summer. For those of you who joined us for the last event, welcome back. For those who are joining for the first time, I'll offer a brief introduction. The Ideas Exchange is a unique program we created out of our recognition that so much of what makes Columbia University special is being part of the community and joining in the lively conversations that take place between our faculty, our students, alumni, and friends. The pandemic has meant we are required to be off campus. As much as we love our campus and as important as place is, people are more important. Buildings and facilities are important, but who we are is more important than where we are. That's why this summer, a number of our top faculty are both teaching and participating in these special conversations about their work, its impact, and how this pandemic is influencing all of us. For more information on all the exciting events and courses at Columbia this summer, please visit summer.sps.columbia.edu. That's my shameless pitch. We're extremely fortunate to have Professor Brian Greene teaching a course this summer and appearing here tonight. It's really a unique opportunity for Columbia students and all of us to tour the history of time in the universe and hear Dr. Greene discuss his path-breaking and best-selling book, Until the End of Time. Tonight, Professor Greene will be interviewed by Faith Salie, the Emmy Award-winning journalist who regularly appears on NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Tonight's guests will have a conversation that traces what we know about the evolution of the universe and how the human search for meaning straddles both scientific endeavor and the very human impulse to find meaning through art, philosophy, and religion. So with that, I'll turn to Faith to begin tonight's discussion.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Brian, I am, I'm now unmuted. Thank you so much, Stephen. Brian, behind Stephen in the background, because he's in New York City, as am I, and behind me in the background, I hear the 7 p.m. clap in New York City, which is what we do for essential workers. And it really reminds me that we're in this very specific moment of time. And your book, of course, is called Until the End of Time. And it's been on my bedside, which serves as my desk these days, for a little while now. And I have to confess that the title started to have new resonance for me after 12 weeks in lockdown. And I wonder how has your sheltering in place wherever you are been, and has time taken on any kind of a new meaning for you?
Well, I think certain aspects of time certainly have. We have long known that we are a deeply social species. I've long known that in an abstract sense. But when you are cut off in a social sense from the rest of the species, it makes the need for that kind of human contact all the more apparent. And so to me, it really served to emphasize, at least in my mind, the kinds of forces that are at work driving us to be the species, the people that we are. So much of what we do is driven by the capacity of groups of individuals to accomplish things that individuals cannot. So much of what we do is driven by the need to communicate so that the group can behave in a much more effective way than it otherwise would be able to. And once you have the means of communication, once you have language, then things explode in the history of the species. So all of it is driven by the need to have these deep connections with those who are in your group. And that's exactly what we are being denied at the moment. So yes, I think there's a deep resonance with many of the themes that I develop in the book.
And you talk about the need to connect. I wonder, how often do you teach a summer course, which is what you're doing now? This is a very special thing, right?
No, I've never taught a summer course, and it felt to me like the relevant time to do so, because what we want to be clear is that, a lot of the world has had to stop for good reason, for the preservation of the species. But the vibrancy of the human search for understanding, for meaning, to get together in groups and discuss ideas that matter to us, that to me is a vital part of what we do. and to play a small part in that by having a summer course where folks, students can come together and really think about these ideas struck me as something that in its own small way would be a contribution to trying to get us to a place of normalcy, as the word is often used, but a place of being able to get to the kinds of things that matter to us, even in a situation where we're being denied for good reason the typical kind of freedoms that we enjoy.
And I suspect for you, as someone who loves to teach and connect with people, this is also feeding your soul. It's not, you know, the students who are showing up for this are probably helping fuel you as well. And I do want to give a warm welcome to the whole Columbia community, and especially the students in your class this summer. I think right now watching us, this is kind of their homework for tonight, right?
Yeah, if they're not here, then boy, they're in trouble.
Now, you can't tell them what to wear to attend this, but yeah.
Exactly.
So this summer course is basically an opportunity to tour your new book with, you know, it's the entire history of the universe with you as a tour guide. So how does this course differ from others that you might teach in the math and physics departments?
Well, I think the way of going about addressing that question is to note that while I was writing Until the End of Time, I was teaching a version of the course that I'm teaching right now to students at Columbia.
And what was that course called? First Draft?
Yeah, well, it's funny. The students did not know that I was in the process of writing a book, but for me, it was indeed an opportunity to have young, curious, energetic, often very independent minds responding to the kinds of ideas that I was developing in the book. So it was a very useful thing to have that kind of ongoing conversation. And I have to say that teaching this material to students, for me, has been a radically different experience than any other teaching I have ever done. Normally, when I teach a course in quantum mechanics or general relativity or quantum field theory, what is the goal? The goal is I want the kids to get a technical understanding of certain equations, be able to solve them, be able to analyze them, and in that way gain this technology, this mathematical technology for solving and making headway on certain kinds of problems. This course is completely different because in this book, the goal is not to gain technical proficiency. It's to really think through what fundamental science can tell us about the nature of the world and about the nature of our lives. Fundamental science is one story among a whole collection of nested stories that rest upon Schrodinger's equation and Einstein's field equations, but build upon it in a language more relevant to things that matter to us in the everyday. I mean, the chemist takes the physicist's ideas, so to speak, and builds them into molecules. The biologist takes that and builds it into cells. You go further, and of course, the psychologist, the neuroscientist understands or works toward an understanding of how the cells come together inside a human brain. And once this human brain has conscious self-reflection, then we need to tell stories in that language, the language that allows us to understand why we think and feel, why we have certain reactions to the world, and why it is that we engage in certain kinds of behaviors, given that ultimately we are just bags of particles governed by physical law. And that story is one that I have found affects people, affects students in a very different way from solving Schrodinger's equation.
Does that mean that in this type of a class, there are more hands in the air? There's more of a ratio of hearing your students speak or ask questions than there is of their, you know, purely listening to you?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's an interesting sociological question about dynamics in a classroom. If you have some students that are really willing to break the ice and ask those questions, then it can change the dynamic completely. But I view that more as a function of the students that happen to be there in a given term. Rather, the different reaction that I find is not so much the number of hands that go into the air, but rather, I've never had students, when I teach quantum mechanics, come into my office and break down. I've never had students come into my office when I teach quantum mechanics and say, "You're kind of shaking my world a little bit here." And that reaction, where students are willing to rethink things that they have been living, say, for 20 years since they were young kids, their philosophical outlook, their theological, their religious outlook, their question of what really matters. Those kinds of issues come to the fore when you're trying to probe deeply into why things are the way they are and how things got to be the way they currently are and what things will be like in the far, far future. And when you recognize, and perhaps we'll talk about here, that everything ultimately disintegrates, everything falls apart, all life, all mind, everything is gone. If you go sufficiently far in the future, that can affect your sense of what matters.
Is that, I mean, it's astonishing to hear that this course elicits such emotional reactions from your students. I mean, it elicited emotional reactions from me as a reader. And I wonder if, I mean, you just gave away the big headline, right? The good news, bad news. The bad news is, as you say, you know, everything in time, how do you say it? You say it in its fullness will die, right? Life in its fullness will die. Good news is essentially you're saying, well, we're here now. Let's embrace that. Is that what you wanted people to come away from when they finished this book? What did you want to affect in your readers?
Well, I wanted people to have the grandest possible perspective on reality by telling the largest possible story, which is the universe from our best understanding of how it began to our best understanding of how it will conclude. And I think seeing your life within that grand cosmological unfolding changes the nature of your view of yourself and your view of the world. And I would say that your summary is a pretty good one. It's not meant to be an original statement. We've been hearing from philosophers and sages, mindfulness teachers across the ages, that you need to live in the moment is the language that's used. You need to focus on the here and now. That's the stuff that really matters, right? And so many people have come to this conclusion. The way I get to this conclusion in this book is by a very different route. It's by telling this cosmological story, which when you take it fully to heart, I think is very convincing in that looking outward to the universe and looking to leaving a legacy and looking toward things that will last, all of those things that drive the human spirit are ultimately baseless. And when you recognize that, it focuses your brain and it focuses your attention in a different way. Rather than looking out to the universe to find meaning and purpose, rather than looking to the future to leave legacy and in that way have some sort of impact on how reality will be, you recognize that what really matters is the here and now. It's just getting there from a very different route.
I feel like you should be the guest lecturer in the French lit department for their existentialism course, right?
Well,
that's Sartre.
Well, it is, and those are the deep influences on me throughout my life. I mean, not in this book, but in a book called Fabric of the Cosmos that I wrote some years ago. I tell a story in the very first page of grabbing off my dad's bookshelf, The Myth of Sisyphus, and reading what Camus says in there. And the very first line of that book is on something like the only true philosophical question is that of suicide, right? Is it worth carrying on in this life? And certainly the existential perspective, which I encountered by chance as a young kid reading that book and have immersed myself in ever since, is a deep part of my thinking. I, however, like Camus in that book, he says something to the effect of whether the world has 6 or 9 dimensions. I'm not getting it exactly right. Whether the brain has 12 components doesn't matter. Only thing that matters is life worth living. And my view is quite different from that. Whether the world has 6 or 9 dimensions, whether the brain has 12 categories, whether the structure of reality is what we think it is or whether it is not what we think it is, does matter. How can you judge the value of life if you are placing that life in a reality you don't understand, right? When a fish is trying to think about the nature of life, a very limited perspective, because the fish never leaves the water. maybe the fish look at us and say, look at those silly humans, right? They think that we don't know anything about, but putting that possibility to the side, if you don't know the full nature of reality, I don't think you can answer Camus' question. So part of why I do physics is to try to gain the deepest understanding of what reality is. And questions of the number of dimensions of space does come into that story, even though Camus sort of put that to the side as a secondary issue that ultimately needs to be subservient to the question of the value of life. I think they're on par.
You mentioned Sisyphus, and Sisyphean is a word we use a lot in my house because I have 2 little kids, and every time we're cleaning up, we just say this is Sisyphean. Or lately, a lot of times we've been saying entropic. And there's a lot of entropy in your book. And that is part of the hard science that you kind of use to lay the foundation to then in your book talk about language and belief and religion in our brains. And I want to talk about what you call the entropic 2-step, because you say that these 2 things, entropy and evolution, are great dance partners. And while entropy, degrades and creates disorder, and evolution creates order and builds, they still somehow push us forward. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so you're right. The idea of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics is this notion that physical systems have an overwhelming tendency to go from an ordered state to a disordered state, from a structured state to a state in which this structure has disintegrated. That kind of withering away, we understand well as the natural tendency of matter that's made up of particles that are randomly jiggling about. And so were that to be the only dominant force guiding the patterns of reality, then you would think that we would just head toward oblivion pretty quickly, right? Disintegration is the tendency of all matter, and therefore it all will fall apart. But what fights against that, at least for a period of time, is evolution. And by evolution, I don't just mean the version that many of us learn in, say, high school biology class, which kicks in once there's life. The idea of evolution by natural selection is a much more general phenomenon. People have known this for a long time. Even individual molecules that learn the trick of replication, making copies of themselves, they are subject to natural selection. Those molecules that are better able at having children, better able at making copies of themselves, will grab more resources from the natural environment, and therefore those molecules will dominate the molecular demographics. And when those molecules replicate and there's a little error or change, they mutate. If the mutation is even better at making copies of itself, it will dominate. There's a kind of chemical combat that takes place at the level of molecules, not at the level of living systems, the level of molecules, that tends to refine their structure so they become better able to survive, to grab material from the environment within which they are immersed. So that tendency is toward building up organization, building up order. So you've got evolution going in one direction, building ever more refined structures. You've got entropy going the other direction, tending to degrade those structures. And what we are systems that exist for a brief period of time in which we are able to stave off the drive toward ever greater disorder, the entropic drive, and maintain our orderly state for the duration of our lives. And when we are no longer able to stave off entropic decay, that is when we end. And indeed, that process is mirrored right throughout the cosmos. Planets, stars, galaxies.
Always win?
Entropy will always win.
Why entropy? Why is there entropy? Why do things always have to eventually degrade?
Well, it's actually a very simple idea that can be made mathematically rigorous. The mathematical rigor is what makes it more complicated to understand. But when you realize that entropy is nothing but the number of rearrangements of the ingredients in a system that leave it pretty much looking the same, then you realize that the tendency to go toward systems in which there are ever more rearrangements is a dominant force in the world. I mean, an example, in fact, I just gave this to my class. If you're walking along a beach and you pick up a handful of sand, you throw it in the air, it lands on the beach, Do you think that the beach looks any different because of that? Of course not. It was disordered collection of sand. You threw it up in the air and it was still a disordered collection of sand. High entropy, ordinary situation. But to get non-high entropy, ordered situations, that's hard. You have to have the ingredients come together in a manner that's so precise and so organized in its structure that it requires a delicate balance of forces to emerge for that system to come into existence. So if you're, for instance, talking about any orderly system like a crystal, all parts of the crystal are arranged in a nice repeating pattern. And it's that repeating pattern that is difficult or more unusual to happen in a world in which particles are just randomly moving about.
It's so rare. And you make so many allusions to the arts in your book that as you were describing that, I keep thinking about that's why we go see ballet. That's why we go see bodies moving precisely together for a moment in time. And we leap to our feet and applaud it because it is so rare.
Yeah, and that's right. So the organized nature of creations that we value is certainly part of the reason why we are drawn toward them. There are other reasons too that we are drawn. I mean, it's a controversial subject why we create art. I mean, if you think about our ancient forebears, and there's evidence that artistic pursuits were undertaken way back in the ancestral past. Why would one of our ancestors spend time, energy, resources on an activity that doesn't seem to have any survival value associated with it? And, there are different views on this. Steven Pinker famously described the arts in some sense as cheesecake of the mind. Our minds are well suited to take in certain kind of stimuli in the natural world. And that does help us to survive. And what the art to do is sort of preys upon our natural sensitivities and overwhelms them with like a cheesecake-like experience that just, gets us all zipped up and wild for this kind of stimulation.
Fat, yes.
Exactly. I mean, those of our forebears who learned to eat nuts and ripened fruits, they're the ones that had enough calories to survive when times turned lean. But now that tendency of ours to like sweets and fats, well, you go eat some Haagen-Dazs pistachio, we don't consider that to be a health promoter in the current environment. Rather, it's preying upon that earlier sensitivity that did help us. And maybe the arts are like that. This suggestion is. But some, my view, which I'm convinced by a number of people who talk about these ideas, my view is, look, the arts, that's a playground of the mind. That's a place where we develop the most exquisite ingenuity and innovation. That's where the creative juices are given their free rein. And it's those creative juices that ultimately have allowed us to survive. It's our ability to problem solve in unusual, spectacularly unusual ways, which is why we are here. I mean, I like to think if there were two races, human beings and let's say a Spock-like race, very logical, don't do anything that isn't sort of logically justifiable, I think we would win out. I think we'd win out because the logical approach won't go on those wild flights of fancy that yield unexpected insights into the nature of the world. So
and yet science is not, it's not binary, right? It's not that science is not creative or imaginative and the arts are. You're not saying science is not creative, even though it's logical, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, the greatest breakthroughs in the book, I sort of describe Einstein as the pinnacle example. Einstein had this capacity to just look out in the world and undertake the most unexpected rearrangements of the concepts that we had to understand that world. There's this wonderful quote of Glenn Gould when he talks about why the music of Bach is so moving to him and of course to others. And he describes how in a Bach fugue, the ability to rearrange the harmonic progressions in a whole spectacular range of ways that are still deeply appealing and deeply moving. It's that rearrangement of the patterns of the music that gives those works their grandeur. And Einstein did the same thing, rearranging not notes. He was rearranging the concepts of space and time and speed and light. And he rearranged them in a manner that ultimately reflected reality better than anything that came before. And that kind of rearrangement, it's an artistic rearrangement. It's a flight of creative energy that you can't, I don't think you can be, well, look, you could, but I don't really see the way that you'd be logically led to that answer. I mean, obviously ultimately you could, but Einstein just had this capacity to look out and rearrange and say, aha, there's the right pattern. There's the pattern that feels right. He works out the mathematics behind it, and in that way makes predictions. I mean, Einstein was able to come up with ideas pictorially, put the math to them later, and then they're tested and they're right.
You have, I mean, while we're sort of talking about the arts and humanities, you have this chapter called Language and Story, and you examine how we use stories to, you say, explode the limits of our narrow experiences. And you quote Charlotte's Web. You say, and we can marvel at how a carefully arranged collection of grunts and glides and fricatives and stops can convey insight into the nature of space and time, or provide an affecting portrait of love and death. And this is, quote, Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the new spiders ever quite took her place in his heart. And the last time I read those words, Brian, was a year ago to my little kids, one of them on my lap, and I started sobbing. Not just like this kind of middle-aged mom weeping, but like sobbing so that they were clinging to me and trying to comfort me. And it made me wonder, you know, you talk about the elegance and the romance of mathematics, and you talk with passion about Einstein's creativity. Has something in math or physics or theory ever elicited that kind of emotional response in you?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. You know,
What?
well, first I'll say, by the way, the Charlotte's Web quote, like, I have to hold back every time I hear those words too. I mean, there's certain kinds of descriptions of the world that are so simple and so beautiful that they just reach you in a very deep place. And for me, and obviously for you, that is one. But from the math and physics side of things, I had this deep urge to learn the general theory of relativity when I got to college, and I didn't have the preparation for it. So I just went to the bookstore and bought a textbook on the general theory of relativity. And this is true. I mean, I would walk around with that book with me all the time. And sometimes I'd sort of caress the surface. You know, I so wanted to understand that book. It was Steven Weinberg's book, Principles and Applications of the General Theory of Relativity. And it was some years later, finally, that I could understand what was in there. And when I finally got to the Einstein field equations that I'd sort of seen for a long period, didn't know what it meant. When I finally understood what it meant, yeah, it affected me in the same way. This brilliant, simple equation, r mu nu minus a half g mu nu r equals 8 pi g over c to the fourth t mu nu. That simple little mathematical formula describing the evolution of the universe, the Big Bang, the formation of black holes, why starlight goes on a curved trajectory as it goes near the sun. I mean, these kinds of insights in that simple collection of symbols, you know.
I love that it's simple to you. But when you did have that moment where it made sense for you, it was very emotional?
Yeah, well, that for sure. You know, because you feel like you have finally seen a deep truth that's out there, but was inaccessible. And of course, that was a truth that Einstein revealed to the world. But, you know, there have been moments, and they're very few, unfortunately, but that's the fact of life, of being immortal in a world that every so often has a giant like an Einstein. But, you know, in my own work, on occasion, when I've come upon a result that no one has seen before, no one anticipated before, yeah, there can be an emotional sense of that as well, because even though the insight is nowhere near the kind of impact of Einstein's equation, the general theory of relativity, when you come upon something new that nobody knows before, and you feel as though you and the universe are embracing for a moment, that you're seeing something that nobody else has yet seen, yeah, there's a deep emotional sense of connection that's hard to achieve in any other way.
Do you think we're missing a general sense of awe these days as a culture?
It's always hard to generalize, because there are many great teachers who are able to inspire that sense of awe in students. There are many students around the world and many researchers around the world who regularly feel that sense of awe, and they value that sense of awe. But of course, if we move away from that to the general sense of, say, where America is at the moment and where some other countries are at the moment, yeah, there's been this turn away from the deep insights that expertise can reveal, and a kind of flattening of things to a general consensus where every opinion matters. And on some things, every opinion matters. But on some other things, every opinion does not matter. On other things, the truth matters. And the truth is so deep and so moving and so spectacular if you're willing to put a little effort in to seeing what that truth is. I mean, I've spoken about ideas of cosmology and black holes to kids, for instance, who thought they hated science. And then to see them have their eyes open in a very different way, and to recognize the look in their eyes where they say, wow, that's cool. Yeah. There's the awe that you're referring to. Yeah, there's something quite special about that. And overall, I would agree that there's nowhere near enough of that happening.
There is something, especially in these days, of what you suggest, everyone thinking his or her opinion matters, or there is something awesome about something always being true. Always. This is always true. This is, I mean, for you, this is math. Like this is the language. This is the beauty. This is the romance that you describe. Yeah. I am curious though about how much of this big picture stuff that scientists are still debating. I mean, what are the big unknowns that still drive and motivate physics and cosmology today?
Well, many of the big unknowns are the ones that have been at the forefront of motivation for a long time, but we've long known they were out of reach and would likely be out of reach for some time. We still do not know how the universe began. We have insight into how the universe evolved from a split second after the beginning.
Wait, so Big Bang is not something everyone agrees on?
Well, you see, Big Bang is a theory not of cosmic origin. It's a theory of cosmic evolution. It's a theory of how the cosmos changed from a split second after it came into existence. That's really what the Big Bang tells us. It doesn't actually tell us why there is something rather than nothing. It doesn't tell us why there were the conditions necessary for the rapid swelling of space, which is what the Big Bang is. That rapid swelling of space, why did it happen? And we've gone further back, and there's the inflationary theory that at least gives some sense of what force pushed everything apart. But why were the conditions right for that force to be there? Why were space and time in existence? So these kinds of very deep questions.
What do you think? Hold on. What do you think?
I don't have any, I'd be writing the paper right now. I mean, these are ideas that we struggle with, and people try to make headway with ever more sophisticated approaches like string theory, an approach that tries to put gravity and quantum mechanics together. For years, I was beating on string theory to try to gain deeper insight into cosmology, the evolution of the universe. And sure, we had some results and some progress, but the question is as unresolved today as it has always been. And it may be one of those questions that resists solution for a long time, maybe till the end. I don't know.
So if there isn't an agreement about how it all began, does everyone agree that there is an end to time? Is that scientifically something that's agreed upon? It's all going to go.
Well, it all depends on precisely what one means by the end of time. So in the book, you may know toward the later chapters, I describe how structures that we are familiar with will come to an end. I describe how life, how planets, how stars will come to an end. I even describe how consciousness as a phenomenon will likely come to an end because, going back to our discussion of entropy, thought itself is a physical process. That physical process generates entropy, generates heat, generates disorder. And in about 10 to the 50 years, the universe will be unable to absorb the disorder associated with even a single thought. So if a thinking—
Wait, how far away is this?
About 10 to the 50 years. And so it's a long time from now. But what will happen there is any thinking being that still exists, when they think one more thought, they will fry, they will burn, they will die in the heat generated by the very process of thought itself. So these are ends of familiar things. But whether time itself comes to an end, whether the overarching structure of space and time is such that it only has a finite duration, that's highly controversial. And in the book, I describe a number of scenarios that maybe space continues to expand forever. Maybe space expands and then comes back, and the universe undergoes a cyclical process of birth, death, and rebirth. So there's a lot of discussion and argument about what will happen in the far future. But as far as the structures in the universe are concerned, most everyone agrees that they will have a finite duration, that they will die.
The structures will, but the universe will not?
Yes, that's right. So it's conceivable that it could restart in the very far future. Quantum mechanics is a very interesting way of describing the world, because within quantum mechanics, anything that has a non-zero probability of taking place, not forbidden by the laws, but even if it's highly unlikely, if you wait long enough, even the most unlikely things will happen. So if there is a non-zero chance of the universe restarting in some sense, and there is, according to our best understanding, then if you wait long enough, if space and time themselves persist, then the universe could restart.
You know, in your book, when you discuss the Big Bang and the theory, I was surprised to know that it was conceived, articulated by a Jesuit priest named Georges Lemaitre, right?
Yes. Yeah, well, you've said that much better than I could, so thank you.
Merci. So I was so struck by the fact that he was presumably a spiritual man, a man of religion, working with this arcane science. And you talk about I love the chapter in your book called Brains and Belief. And I wonder about your relationship with religion, and can one, like Georges Lemaitre, have fully understand and believe a physicist's view of the universe and have some kind of belief in a higher being of any kind? Does that happen? Do you know about Lemaitre?
Oh, it does happen. And in fact, years ago, I was invited to a seminar. I think it was called Science in the Spiritual Quest. And it was described to me as a number of high-level scientists that in a closed-door setting were going to be open and free about their religious beliefs. And I was like, yeah, that'd be interesting to go to. I assumed that all of us would have the same perspective, right? My perspective is, sure, it's possible that there is a higher being. My perspective is there can be value to having a belief in a higher being, but my view is that the world is not governed by a higher being. My view is that it's ultimately the laws of physics acting on the particles. I have a very straightforward scientific physicist perspective when it comes to the objective workings of the world. But at this meeting, I was shocked. There were Nobel laureates there, colleagues of mine, and their view was completely different. Many of them had a deeply religious outlook on the world. And I remember speaking with one of them at the conclusion of the seminar, and I said to him, when you look at me, what do you think? Am I misguided and a very nice man, he kind of put his arm around me, sort of a avuncular way. And he said, you're a smart guy. You're going to get there, and it was basically, and so yes, is the answer to your question. There are many, many different perspectives. Now I should say, I've been a professional physicist. I don't know how you define that, but since I got my PhD, it's been 35 years since I got my PhD, 35 years. The number of conversations I've had with physics colleagues that venture into any of these questions of religion or spirituality, next to none. It's not like as we're pondering the equations of the universe, we're like, oh, so what we got, the spiritual and religious qualities that these equations brush up against are generally not part of the common discourse in the field. But, Lemaitre is this great example of someone who is trained in religion, trained in science, had a PhD from MIT, and was willing to look at the kinds of questions of relevance to each way of looking at the world.
I mean, I've always been struck by Einstein's choice of words, right? He said, never lose a holy curiosity. And he talks that famous line about there are two ways of living your life, right? One is if everything's a miracle. One is if, well, I think he sets up the negative first. One's as if nothing's a miracle, right, and one's as if everything is. And from what I know about Einstein, he wasn't, he wouldn't have called himself religious, but that is a kind of mystical spiritual lexicon.
Totally. And I think Einstein might have called himself spiritual. I don't know if he actually used those words, but he was enamored and moved by the harmonies of the universe. And if you take a sort of Spinozian view of what God is, that there's sort of pantheistic view that God is the harmonies of the world. If you define God in that way, then it's compatible with everything that we're doing. It becomes more difficult to take that perspective when you have a literal interpretation of, say, the dominant religions in the world. It is very difficult to square those with scientific understanding. But if you move away from that literalism, which of course Einstein did, and it's my perspective too, I consider myself to be deeply spiritual in the sense that I am deeply interested in not just understanding the objective qualities of the world. I love those things. That's what I spent my life trying to figure out. But I'm as interested and as moved by the question of the inner world of conscious self-reflection. And if understanding oneself better is part of a spiritual journey, then it's a journey that I'm happy to be on.
But that inner world, which you do, you always strike me as someone who has this really healthy balance of reverence and irreverence. But that inner world, Brian, is something you always refer to as bags of particles. So I can never sort of negotiate how there is this kind of reverence for bags of particles.
Yeah, well, let me try to give you that sensibility. I'll feel like I've achieved something if by the end of the next small phrase you say, I got it. Okay. That's my goal here. So look, here's my view. So we are, in this way of thinking about things, as you say, bags of particles governed by physical law. Now, when you hear that, that sounds pretty mechanistic. It sounds pretty much wiping out everything that matters to us. But the point that I make is how spectacular that particles in these bags, governed by the ironclad laws of physics, when they're arranged in the right way, they can think, they can feel, they can write the Ninth Symphony, they can sculpt the burghers of Calais, they can build the pyramids, they can
write Charlotte Web.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yes.
So how amazing is that that if there is nothing else, and all we are collections of particles governed by these insensate laws of physics, that yet by evolution, our structure is so exquisite that we can do these things. It makes it yet more spectacular, not less, that we're just bags of particles.
No, I do understand that. And I do think that's part of what drives people like you, is that discovering the why and the how never diminishes the awesomeness.
It adds to it.
It enhances it.
Adds to it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just touching on religion, I was struck by this personal story you share in your book. And I'll ask you to share it briefly about when your dad took you for a walk through Central Park when you were about 10. And what did you see?
Well, yeah. So yeah, it was just a nice sunny day. My dad took my sister for this walk in Central Park, and we came upon a large gathering of Hare Krishna devotees who were a member by the band shell. You know where that is, obviously, Central Park. And they were all with the drums and chanting and the bells and so on. And I look over and my brother, who I thought was at college was there in this group. And so it was
Hare Krishna, right?
Hare Krishna. So it was my dad's way of sort of introducing, this wasn't by chance. My dad knew that he was going to be there. And so this is my dad's way of sort of, I don't know, gently letting us know that our brother's life had taken a rather unexpected turn into a different direction. And it was a powerful moment. And look, my brother and I, we are interested in almost exactly the same questions. We've had a lifetime of conversations that have focused upon cosmology and the origin of the universe and the meaning of life and what is it to be a conscious being. We just approach these questions from radically different perspectives. And sometimes those conversations have been rich, sometimes frustrating, but in the end, it's sort of remarkable to see two siblings approach the same kinds of questions just from these radically different pathways toward truth.
Yeah. Before we go to questions from the audience, I wanted to say, among the many things that I love about your latest book is how personal it is. Considering you've written about everything and then nothing, you reveal a lot about yourself without making the book about you. You know, you talk about, there's this gutting story about watching a dog die right next to you and how that affected you. And I love this story about when you're on a solo camping expedition and you comforted yourself by drawing a face on the inside of the tent. Would you say that this is your most personal book?
Oh, without a doubt. You know, my earlier books were all about trying to be, in some sense, a translator from the arcane language of mathematics to the more familiar language of everyday experience so that people would understand whatever string theory or quantum mechanics or relativity and so forth. But there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity or even a reason for anything personal to play a role in that kind of a description. In this book, my point, as I mentioned before, is to develop these nested stories of reality and basically trying to convince the reader that the kinds of questions you ask determine the language, the vocabulary, the lexicon within which the most insightful answers can be found. If you're interested in the fundamental laws and particles, sure, use quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. If you're interested in how we humans respond to a beautiful sunset or a tragic encounter, then you need to use the language of the poet. And so how strange and odd in some sense would it have been that in a book developing these different layers, these different stories, for me not to tell the one human story that I know intimately, which is my own. So you're right, I did not want to make this book about me, but I felt that injecting moments here and there that made clear that there's a human level story embedded, entwined with, nested with all of the other accounts from the origin of the universe, origin of language and story and myth and religion and creative expression, that within that there is a human story that threads its way through. It felt to me that it would be a real loss to not include that story as part of the account.
Thank you for all the stories. They really, it relative to some other science reading, they make everything so resonant. So thank you for them. A lot of them are also funny, like your mother, who is very fastidious about what she eats, saluting cheesecake.
Yes.
A family who ordered cheesecake at the next table.
Exactly right.
All right, we have a question from Jennifer. I hope I say your last name right. Jennifer Gates. She may be one of your students. What is the greatest challenge you are trying to resolve now in your field?
Well, the biggest challenge I'd say right now is to really understand what space and time are. For many centuries, we've assumed that space and time exist, and then we've understood how things behave within that environment. Einstein came along and said, well, you got to change that description a little bit because space and time actually respond to the environment. They're not an inert backdrop. They're not just this stage that's fixed. It changes. But still, we have been at a loss to say, well, is time made of something else? Are there atoms of space and atoms of time, the way there are atoms of oxygen and hydrogen? Could it be that there's some realm of reality in which the ingredients of space and time exist, but they haven't coalesced in the right manner to yield familiar space and time as we experience them? Could there be a spaceless and timeless kind of reality out there? And remarkably, there have been developments in the last 5-10 years that have started to provide tools for answering questions like that. I never thought this would happen, not in my lifetime. And it's very exciting to see how these tools may allow us to give not the full answer, but perhaps partial answers to those deep questions.
But when you use words like that, see how these tools develop, is that all math? Are those tools equations?
It's totally math, because we're talking about parts of reality that we don't have access to. I mean, if we could probe to arbitrarily small distance scales, maybe we would see if there are atoms of space or time. But even our most powerful microscope, which is the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, it can only probe down to whatever, 10 to the minus, whatever, 15, 16, 17 meters or something. We're talking about many, many, many orders of magnitude smaller than that to even have a chance of literally seeing the kinds of qualities of the world that we're talking about. We can't do that. So it's all math.
When you're discussing this, when you're articulating into words for me or even for your colleagues, is there a part of your brain that can conceptualize that, a spaceless, timeless dimension?
Not really. If you're asking me, can I conceptualize it as a real visual image, I'm as bound to the mental language of space and time as anybody else. We grew up as a species in an environment that has space and time. To survive, we needed to negotiate processes within space and time. So our brains were under no evolutionary pressure to have the flexibility to imagine a realm absent space and time. That doesn't mean that nobody can do it. There are people who claim that they can do it. I don't know if I really believe. I like to think that they're exaggerating. But what I can do is I can write down the equations.
Yeah.
And so when you are fluent in the language of mathematics, the equations begin to provide a different kind of mental imagery. It's not the same kind of pictures that really give you a deep intuition, but you feel like you understand what you're talking about because you've got the mathematical tools for articulating the ideas precisely.
All right, we have a question from a prospective student. I don't know if that means that he will become a student depending on the way you answer this question. I'm not sure. His name is Edward Montoya, and Edward wants to know, has recent video footage of military pilots observing unexplained flying aircrafts influenced your theory of intelligent life in the universe?
No, it hasn't. And the reason for that is there's such a long history of claims of this sort. And number one, they're odd to me. It's hard for me to imagine an advanced civilization being able to travel all the way here and not being able to hide themselves if that's their goal. They're like, oh my God, there's an aircraft. Let's get out of here after traveling, light years.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. But the other side of it is there are so many other kinds of explanations that are much more prosaic and therefore much less interesting that ultimately, in each case that I know about, have been able to explain the phenomenon at hand. So is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. I have an open mind and allow things, but I think Carl Sagan's dictum is an important one here, which is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And we're nowhere near extraordinary evidence for the kinds of claims that I hear people make.
So, a few of us, perhaps sadly, can really use cosmology in our day-to-day lives. I mean, we all exist in the laws of physics, but succumbing to the forces of gravity is involuntary. Why do you think that the ideas in your book are useful and important to ordinary, non-scientist people? What do you think they offer to the public discourse?
Well, I think they offer a different context for thinking about one's life and a different context for thinking about what one values. And in the end, those are the most important considerations that each and every individual has. What to do with their life, what to do with their time, what do they consider to be important and what do they consider to be of value? And so by placing ordinary life within its proper location in the cosmological unfolding, we are not separate from the cosmos. I mean, again, Carl Sagan said it poetically that the cosmos is within us because we're made of star stuff, right? It's become hackneyed, but it's still deeply true. And we are, as I describe in the book, the natural progression, the natural outcome of a universe that started in a certain way and then went on this drive toward ever greater disorder. And we are a resting place along the way where for a brief moment in cosmological history, we can exist. And when you think about your life as part of that story, that grandest of all stories, it cannot help but change your view of what matters in your life. And so I'm not after a universal reaction. My own reaction to this recognition was to spend my life trying to understand the physical universe. And that's no surprise. If you recognize where you fit in the cosmological unfolding, then that tends to focus your attention, if you have the mindset that I do, on the big questions. Well, how did it really start? And how would it really end? And what is this thing that we call time anyway? So that's where it drove me for my life. And I'm not looking for others to have that same response, but I can't help but think that seeing where you fit in to that cosmological tapestry will have an impact on the things that matter to you.
The way I would put it from my experience reading the book is this vivid, powerful acceptance of how, or recognition of how small we are actually makes you feel, as a bag of particles, miraculous.
Yes.
Makes you feel lucky.
That is the point.
Yeah.
Again, you can even quantify that. The odds against our existing, astounding, right? I mean, we are the result of quantum processes that stretch back to the Big Bang until today. And each and every one of those quantum processes could have turned out that way instead of this, yielding a universe in which we would not be here. And yet against those astounding odds, we are here. And then adding to it, what we discussed before is it's not just that we're here, we can do things. And so putting that all together, yes, it is a sense of how miraculous it is to be alive and to be human.
That's kind of the perfect place to end, especially in a pandemic when we're very lucky to be sitting here talking about all this. Yeah.
For sure.
Okay, this is very low-hanging fruit way to end this, but I mean, I do feel like I could talk to you till the end of time. Thank you for this. You have very lucky students this summer, and we're so grateful to the Columbia community who joined us on this lovely early summer evening. Please be sure to tune in for our next Ideas Exchange. It's next week, June 3rd at 7 p.m. Professor of Religion and African American Studies, Joseph Surette, speaks with award-winning author Darnell Moore about religion and hip hop. And Brian Greene, it is always enlightening and a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Faith. This is great.
Be well.